Welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you guys made it here today. If you're here joining us, you're here on the second week of our sermon series on sin. Bum, bum, bum. Last week, if you were here, you would have heard our pastor Justin talk about sin. And if you weren't here last week, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. It was a great sermon. But if you are here this week for the first time, let me catch you up. Justin talked about how sin is missing the mark, that anything less than the perfect bullseye on a target is considered sin, and that this sin can be defined by the law. Sorry, I just kind of lost where I was going with that. That sin can rule over us. We can become self-centered and consumed by our status with this law as Christians. The law was not enough, and that this sin controlled us. But there was hope with Jesus, that he came and defeated sin and saved us from this binding. Sin living in us can never separate us from the love that is God. That sin is death, but we can choose to live in life. So this week, we've read all of your emails talking about what does it look like to live in life? And how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? And so today, I heard you, and I wanted to title this sermon, Life Over Death. Let's pray. Hey God, I just want to thank you for today. As we know, tomorrow is not guaranteed. I just pray that you're with me in these next couple of minutes, that you communicate your word in an effective way. I pray that we just continue to move in faith in you and trust in the heart of your gospel. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. So I want to bring us to Paul in his second recorded letter to the Corinthians, where he describes what living in life is. And he uses kind of the whole letter to do that. So in the next 13 minutes or so, I'm going to try and do that. So buckle up. The passage that I want to read is going to be coming in chapter 12 in verse 7, where Paul is kind of putting his last stamp on these kind of, I guess you could say, haters that Paul is having in the city of Corinth. People who are trying to discredit Paul as a leader. This is the last thing he kind of says to them on basically on what they're trying to do. And so here we go in verse 7. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh. A messenger of Satan was sent to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, and that it should leave me. But he, Jesus, said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Why the heck is Paul saying this? Paul is considered a leader in this church. He started this church in Corinth. Why is he saying, I'm proud of my weakness? That doesn't make sense as a leader. Most of the time you see kings who just want to show everyone how much power they are. Or presidents, how much rule they really have, how much control they have. They try and get control. And Paul's kind of doing the opposite. So I think to understand how Paul got here, we need some context. Paul was an apostle. And the word apostle means basically he spent time with Jesus. But that was kind of a little shady at this time to some people, because they knew that Paul was not around when Jesus was there. People knew that Paul was not around when Jesus was alive. So how was this possible? But if we know that in Acts, we know that there was a guy named Saul who was a Pharisee who was running around killing Christians, that Jesus stopped him on a road, and then he was transformed from Saul to Paul, this very same Paul that we're talking about today. And then Paul went on to write most of the New Testament. So Corinth was one of his churches, but Corinth was kind of like his rebel child. And I'm sure there's parents in here who know exactly which one of their kids that was. But there was constantly all these false teachers, false prophets, a lot of confusion that was going on in this city. And then when Paul comes and visits before he writes the letter, he comes to encounter these, what he titles, super apostles, which is kind of a mocking term that he gives them. That these super apostles were trying to discredit Paul as a leader, saying that he was an unimpressive speaker, saying that he was in jail a lot and like going through a lot of persecution and suffering, which apparently they contorted or like construed in a way that makes you not a very good leader, I guess. And then lastly, that he was poor, that he was often homeless, that he didn't make a lot, that his clothes were raggedy, he wasn't a man of status, and that just made him a bad leader. And these leaders were constantly bragging about how they're the opposite of Paul, that they were men of wealth, they were men of status, they were all these great things, constantly trying to prove that they were a good leader. And Paul says that he does not need to prove that he's a good leader. He doesn't need proof, and if you really need proof, look at the very church that you belong to. That is proof that I'm an okay leader. The fruit of this is proof of that. And that he doesn't need to live this impressive life. What he does need to do is point to the one who is impressive, which is Jesus. And he explains what life is through Jesus. And he kind of does this in his letter. And he calls it the cruciform life. Jesus was gloriously exalted through pain and suffering on the cross. Jesus' character is self-sacrificing, self-giving love that he constantly wants to give us. Look to the cross and we can choose life and live like Jesus. This is what Paul's trying to do. That all the sufferings, humiliation, poverty is for the church so that it can lead in a way that Jesus led. Jesus didn't really have to become human. It wouldn't really make sense and any other reason for Jesus to come down from heaven, where I'm sure he was having a great time, to spend time with us. Other than that, he loved us. That is the only reason that really makes sense for Jesus to do that. And he came down and he spent time with the marginalized, the cast outs, the diseased, the sick, and he got whipped, beaten, spat on, ridiculed, mocked, and died the most gruesome death in history for you. Jesus lowered himself from where he belonged to be with us so that he could bring us back up with him. That is what Jesus did as a leader, and this is what Paul's trying to do. Paul's saying, I don't need to be impressive. I'm spending time with people who are considerably lower than me so that I can bring them up with me and that we can go to Jesus so he can bring us up with him. That is Paul's mission as a leader. That is all he's trying to do. And he says, it's foolish to talk about your own accomplishments. Paul could care less about his accomplishments. They don't matter. What weight do they hold other than trying to separate himself from everyone else? And if I had more time, I would talk to you about if you surround yourself with great community, they will tell you what you're good at. You don't need to try and tell everyone and remind everyone what you're good at. They'll do that, but I don't have time for that. Paul is most proud of his weaknesses. That is what he's saying in this verse. He says that Jesus told him, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Jesus' power is made perfect in our weaknesses. To start living here, we have to know that we are weak. We have to admit our faults, which is really hard to do. Because God cannot work with someone that refuses to admit that they are broken. If we are perfect, then what's the point of Jesus? Why do you need to come? Why wasn't the law enough? Oh yeah, that's right, because we're not perfect. We're not even close. Some of us will receive this gift of God, this gift of salvation, and then put themselves back in the jail cell because they believe that they belong there and try and work themselves out. If I stop doing this, then I can get to here. If I stay away from temptation from this long, then I'll feel good when I go to church. If I do this, then this will happen. We try and work ourselves out of these chains, and we keep choosing to leave them on when Jesus has already taken them off. This is something that I struggle with daily. Every time that I fall into temptation, I often discredit my own self. I don't need anyone else to discredit me. I am my own worst enemy. I'm way too hard on myself, and I know it's a problem. Guilt and shame can come and control me, and I'll often start thinking, now I'm not going to be a good leader. Who's going to want to follow me? I'm not going to be a good husband. I'm not going to be a fill in the blank. And a while ago, I had this mentor who told me that I'm a person, he said a man, but I want to include everyone. A person that is strong in their faith knows they need help. And that kind of struck my core. And then a couple days later, I found this verse. And this verse changed my life. The passage that we're reading today, it changed my life so much so I got it permanently marked on my arm for the rest of my life. And currently today, it's something that I have to constantly remind myself of, that I can't work myself to life. Mm-hmm. There is no way for me to be here and work myself to get to here. There is nothing that I can do. We are not perfect, and the law will not cut it. It is all on Jesus. The only way to get to here is through Jesus. There is no other way. His grace will always be sufficient for us. We need to stop trying to prove that we are good enough. We need to stop trying to prove that we belong here when the reality is we have no business being here. We need to welcome God into those places that we are weak so we can fill those gaps. Fill those areas that we know that we're not good at so that God's power can work through that. There is no need to try and do the work that Jesus has already done. Be set free from sin. Because of Jesus, sin only has power if we choose to give it that power. Christ has already died the death that we deserved. He took our place. We deserve this, but Jesus stepped in and took it for us. And Paul knows this. Paul knows how amazing the grace of God is. Without Jesus, Paul knows that he is nothing. Without Jesus, we are nothing. Without Jesus in a place like this, we're just a bunch of weirdos waving our hands in the air. It's foolish for Paul to try and prove his status when his status is following Jesus. That's all he cares about being known for. That's it. Stop believing that it is ourselves to do the work when it's all him. We don't need to work to get here. Jesus already did all the work for us. The greatest challenge of the Christian life is not to be so obedient or so devoted or so disciplined enough to belong here, to stay up here. That is not the greatest challenge as a Christian, but we constantly want to make it that. We constantly want to try and prove that we are so faithful that we haven't given into sin in so long. And we try and credit ourselves with that. We try and say that I read my Bible every day this week and I haven't heard the devil. That's on me. And we try and prove it. And we try and say that this is the biggest struggle of a Christian, to follow the will of God. That's not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is believing in the truth of the gospel. How is this possible? That this scandalous and audacious love that is freely given from us set us free from what we deserve and gives us the best gift that we can have in life. As you give Jesus your sin, you can stand here free as he walks to the cross and takes your place. Quit trying to take that back. His love is powerful enough to save you, and it's definitely powerful enough to sustain you. That you don't have to put yourself back in these chains. You can be free. Jesus is enough, and he will always be enough to be here. Start choosing this and stop putting yourself back here. Thank you.